Private sector, private sector, private sector. So if we break down the private sector, but before we break it down,
sure.
If you look at countries like Saudi Arabia, in the Middle East and elsewhere, in China and all that, there's this relation, there's a way in which infrastructure funding are broken down. In India, for example,
sure.
and you talk about a 5-year, 10-year, 15-year rolling plan of $100 billion, for example,
yes.
or $200 billion for countries like China, and they break it down over the years.
Yes.
And they bring in the private sector and say, look, we're putting X, Y on the table. You guys bring A, B, C, D, E, and F. Why is it difficult for us to attract this type of funding from DFIs, from others around the world? But we keep talking all the time. Today we got a meeting with the Chinese. Tomorrow we've met with the Taiwanese. The next day we've met with some Europeans. And it keeps going on year after year, but we have nothing delivered on the table for Nigerians.
Well, these are doing business, right? And then which it's just improving, but it's one of the critical issues, facing investors. I come in with an X amount of money. I expect a certain return at a certain time.
But we keep saying that this is the #1 investment destination. The vice president says so. Everybody says so. So why is it that investors are not coming in with these bags of money?
It's, like I said, it's a process, and it's not going to happen overnight. I mean, I think the ball has started to roll. I think there are things put in place to make those things happen, but it's just going to take some time. And that's how, I mean, just trying to cut things short. I think that's probably, how we should look at it, is the time horizon. We need it now, of course, but people are, currently evaluating the process itself. Like I said, could be very, very cumbersome. Going around the country trying to understand where the needs are, and try to drive activity.
We know where all the needs are.
Sure.
We know where the bridges are broken. We know where all the bad roads here.
Of course.
We've got one in front of us here, which is Lagos Ibadan. For 10, 20, 30 years it's been bad. So we know where the roads, we know where the bad roads are, we know where the dams are broken, we know where to put everything. But again, we've had a relationship with a few international organizations like the World Bank.
Sure.
For 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And to date, we still have a very poor infrastructure level.
Yeah, like I said, the deficit is really deep. So there are works going on. Let's not try and scare everybody. There's nothing really going on. But that's just to show you the level of decay and the level of work that needs to be done. It's quite slow, but work is being done. And like I said, there are different kinds of vehicles being put in place to help finance, power, roads, and it's also meaning some form of a fiscal framework around these investments too. So I'm coming to invest. I need to know how I'm going to monetize and make a return. There's no free lunch. So whoever's going to be coming, people need to understand, this PPP structure. People don't understand how am I going to, really monetize these assets. And I think some of those conversations take longer than usual, but those conversations are being had right now.
So between we'll talk a little bit to the side of the DFIs, whether it is the World Bank or the African Development Bank or whatever. But again, if you bring it to the market where you operate, how much do you think the markets can deliver? We'll talk about the organized private sector a little bit later, but from the markets infrastructure fund, what can be brought to the table at the federal level and quickly? We've seen the Sukuk, yes. But some folks say, well, that's 100 billion, that's just a drop in the ocean.
Yeah, listen, they did a green bond towards the end of last year. What the government can bring to the table is immense, but what we believe is the government doesn't have to foot the whole bill. So in a structure of a particular assets, all the government needs to provide is about, like I said, they can bring in, the private sector can actually lever up to 16 times whatever the government brings in. So for every dollar they bring in, the private sector or the partners can actually provide 16 times of that amount of money. In any kind of form. It could be equity, could be project finance debt.
Do you think we should go project specific? And I tend to lean toward this all the time. For example, the Abuja-Kaduna Rail, for example,
sure.
Can we tie that to a specific bond and raise it?
Of course. And if I'm correct, some part of the financing they've raised over the years, in the bond market, some of them have been earmarked towards those projects.
I'm saying, this is what I'm saying. If you say this Abuja-Kaduna infrastructure bond, it's going to cost 100 billion. Hey, Chapel Hill, everybody on the street, on Market Street, invest in it. Bosun, bring your 5,000 naira, invest in this. And you just open it up like an IPO.
Of course.
Kind of.
Yes.
on Broad Street, and we just label it that way. And I know that I have a 5,000 naira that goes into the Kaduna Abuja rail line, goes to the locomotives and this and so and walkers, whatever. And I say, yeah, the government says, look, this is a 10, 20-year boosting, so I can leave my 5,000 naira with the federal government for the next 20 years.
Of course, and infra assets are long-term assets, and you need long-term capital to finance those assets. We've seen in the private sector where people have gone to banks to try and raise, and banks, in sometime in 2019, with Basel III come into effect, banks will not be able to lend long-term capital. I mean, actually, they're not doing that right now in Nigeria, but Basel III really restricts them. So it's still going to come to funds.
And this is the year for Basel III.
Exactly. So, and to your questions around structuring a particular bond, the Sukuk is an example, which was done, and it was clearly stated what the proceeds of those funds will be used for. The green bond, the same thing also. So, of course, you can create, I mean, it's the FGN, so it's more or less a sovereign, so you know your money is safe.
Okay, well, let's talk about an idea.
Sure.
A little bit. What's going to be new with this fund in the next, in 2018?
2018, I mean, we'll definitely be coming to the market to raise more funding. So, as I mentioned earlier, in June of last year, we raised about $5 billion. And we're possibly going to be coming to the market to raise, 2 more times, an average of 15 to 20 billion naira. And what we've done with all the funds we've raised, and just to give you a little more perspective, on our first capital raise, we had 14 investors, 9 of the PFAs invested, an insurance company, asset management firm, and some private individuals. And which shows a diverse investment pool and the belief in the product. In this year, as I mentioned, we come to the market again. To mention, the NSIA invested $5 million, naira equivalent $5 million in our particular this raise we're doing right now, which also gives credence to what we're doing in the market. So we're very hopeful for this year. We have projects lined up which are looking for long-term financing, which we're providing through the capital raise we're doing. So it's looking very promising. As we mentioned earlier, the need for infra financing is immense.
I'm looking at key issues here for this funding in terms of what risk am I looking at? Inflation, interest rate, currency in the new year?
Very good question. So in regards to the infra, there's no currency risk. So all we're doing, we're raising naira and we're lending in naira. Inflation risk, I mean, the returns we're offering about 400 basis points above the 10-year FGN. And if you look at the history of the 10-year FGN versus inflation, with this 400 basis points, which is guaranteed, kind of a lock-in, gives you a hedge over inflation also. So it's a sleep well at night kind of investment. And our, from you mentioned earlier about the dividends we've paid, that's going to be our 3rd dividend we've paid in a short life. I mean, we only went live in June, and we've paid 3 dividends.
Just about 9 months or so.
Yes, exactly, to investors already. And that's the kind of returns we our investors.
That's the kind of returns I want the government to pay me. If you guys can pay that on Broad Street, the big brother should be able to give me 3, 4 quarterly returns on any roads, expressway.
Yeah, so I mean, and the way our fund is structured is a little bit different from what the federal government will do. Federal government, I mean,
should the government come and learn from you?
Well, we'll learn from each other.
Yeah, you learn from each other. But it's okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Buluro from Chapel Hill, Denham.